Nora Gongadis, please.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't know how many of you have stuck around from the last time, but I appreciate you being here. And again, I'm a clinical neurofeedback provider in Portland, Oregon. I'm also a nutritional therapy practitioner. And the subject for this particular topic of discussion is going to be taming the carb craving monster, something I'm sure nobody here has any issue with, but we have nothing better to talk about, so what the heck. And you'll see that I just sort of love Homer Simpson, so the great embodiment of carb issues. Anyway, defining carbs, which is kind of a surprising thing, but occasionally people go, what exactly are carbs? Well, carbs actually, and carbohydrates encompass a broader variety of things than we're actually going to be talking about, but in the diet, of course, they include things like sugar, starches, and fiber. And our sources include simple sugars of all kinds, all grains, bread, pasta, potatoes, sugar-sweetened sodas, desserts, natural sweeteners, honey, maple syrup, agave, etc., white or brown rice, corn, starchy or root vegetables, legumes, and fruit. And for our topic of discussion here, sugar and starch are going to constitute the utilizable form of carbohydrates we'll be mostly referring to throughout this presentation. So that's, when I'm talking carbs here, I'm not talking fiber and your fibrous vegetables and greens and things, whole different subject. Mainly talking sugar and starch. These are the carbohydrate-containing foods that we're mainly talking about here. And if you're drooling at any of this, you know you have an issue. You've come to the right place. So, all this stuff. And yes, including, honey and agave and all that stuff, and even the real maple syrup. So, these are the fibrous vegetables and greens. These are not what we're talking about here. However, these are also technically carbohydrates. But I personally advocate including as many of these as you would like in whatever form you would like in your diet throughout the day. Not just for there really isn't a human dietary requirement for fiber. I talk about this in my book. I don't want to get into it right now. But I do think that the antioxidants and the phytonutrients in these foods are far more important to us now than they probably ever used to be in our earlier evolutionary history. So I encourage people to consume as much of this as they want or like. So Carbohydrate Basics 101, you might as well start with the basics, right? Glucose, of course, is the primary form of carbohydrate used for energy in the body. And by the way, although it is popularly believed that glucose is our primary source of fuel, most people believe that the brain and the body have to have glucose in order to function. This is not true. It's only conditionally true. It is true only if you have metabolically adapted yourself to depending upon glucose as your primary source of fuel. But in reality, the only tissue in the body that absolutely has to have glucose, no matter what, in order to survive, in order to function normally, are our red blood cells, because they feed anaerobically in order to protect their precious cargo, which is oxygen. So red blood cells have to have glucose. That's sort of a cruel reality. We have to have some. But, well, we don't have any dietary requirement for it, certainly. And our body can manufacture it absolutely as much as it needs in order for us to function. But the unfortunate state is that most people you see walking loose have metabolically adapted themselves to depending on sugar as the primary source of fuel, and therein lies the problem. It is not the only fuel source that we can survive on under most conditions. Glucose, again, it's an anaerobic. It's primarily an anaerobic fuel. It burns most efficiently away from the presence of oxygen. Not only, but most efficiently it burns away from the presence of oxygen. It's basically our turbocharged source of quick mental and physical energy. It's turbo fuel. It's sort of like putting rocket fuel in your engine, which, if you're running a race or you're trying to outrun something that, that wants to eat you or something like that, then, that's very useful. But if you're just kind of getting through the day and taking a drive down to the corner grocery store for this or that, or going to your farmer's market, you don't need turbo fuel in your engine to do that. But this is the way most people fuel themselves throughout the day. And there are consequences to running on rocket fuel all the time. Carbohydrates comprise really no more than 2% of our bodily structure. In other words, certain types of connective tissue. Carbohydrates can provide some forms of immune support in the form of glyconutrients or immunoglobulins. They're sort of glyconutrient-based glycoproteins, which we manufacture internally. We make these. We don't have to consume carbohydrates to have these glyconutrients. We need just the tiniest amount. Fiber forms, of course, bulk, binds. It's a useful function for fiber. It can bind excess hormones for elimination, can provide, of course, some substrate nutrients for gastrointestinal flora. Of course, fiber in excess also has a downside. The flip side of that coin is that it can bind minerals and make those unavailable to you, too. You can really go overboard with fiber and give yourself mineral deficiencies if you're not careful. So excesses of sugar and starch amounts more than needed for your immediate energy. For right now, I'm out running I'm running a race right now, or I'm trying to outrun something that wants to eat me right now, or whatever. These things are first, whatever we're not using for energy, gets first converted to limited amounts of glycogen in the liver and in the muscles. The glycogen we store in the muscles actually can only be used by the muscles. It's there for physical exertion and all of that, lifting kettlebells, which I like to do. That's my form of exercise. And then, of course, the liver, from which most gluconeogenesis occurs, is in the liver. The rest is converted to triglycerides and is stored as body fat. So if you have high triglycerides, folks, it's not because you had butter. It's because you put your butter on toast. So I just stick to the butter. Well, actually, I'm not even really doing butter anymore. I'm mainly doing ghee, but that's a whole other subject. Enough about me. So some dietary carbohydrates are also converted, to cholesterol. There's this enzyme in the liver called HMG-CoA reductase that, especially if you're not eating enough cholesterol, your body will get really good at synthesizing cholesterol from carbohydrates in your diet. And of course, this is the people that manufacture statin drugs know this very well. Rather than suggesting to you, why don't you eat fewer carbohydrates and more cholesterol so you shut off your own internal production of cholesterol and have everything normalized, they suggest you take this unnatural substance that with all kinds of potentially nasty and even lethal side effects in order to manage your numbers. Don't get me started. Nearly all unwanted body fat, by the way, is made from sugar. Fat consumed in the presence of sugar and starch behaves very differently than fats consumed in the absence of sugar and starch. It behaves very differently. Your body, when it gets presented with sugar and starch, will always choose sugar to burn first, because sugar is an incredibly damaging substance. It glycates things, it creates a lot of free radical activity. Our body is obsessed with maintaining the minimum necessary levels of blood sugar. When that gets exceeded, your body says, shove the fat aside, we're going to deal with the sugar first. We're burning that first. Could be an emergency. This is going to be our primary source of fuel right now. And when that's gone, we'll start looking at the fats and whatever else that may be available. And so when we consume carbohydrates, again, in excess of what we can use or can store as glycogen, and we only store enough glycogen, we can't even get through a full day on what we store as glycogen. Most of that gets used up pretty quickly. The rest is going to get converted to triglycerides and stored in your body as unwanted body fat. And the vast majority of weight problems can be directly associated with excesses of sugars and starch in the diet. And only very small amounts of, if you eat dietary fat to excess, or you eat dietary fat in the presence of sugar and starch, you will store some of that too. But again, not all calories are equal. The calories and proteins and fats they're not just purely used for energy. We're not a heat engine, folks. We're a chemical factory. And a calorie isn't a calorie isn't a calorie. Some of the calories we consume from protein and fat, most of those calories are going to go to structure. They go to rebuilding and maintaining our protein reserves in any number of hundreds of ways. Our fats go to hormones, they go to cellular membranes, they go to our brain function, our neurological functioning, they go to many, many, many other things apart from just simply energy. But carbohydrates, really only a very small portion, maybe 2% of our actual structure is actually based in carbohydrates. And we don't need any of that from our diet. So every molecule of carbohydrate that you don't need to outrun a charging rhino right now is basically going to get stored somehow. And oftentimes in ways we would rather not store it. So, fun facts. Of all of the major macronutrients, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, include water in that too. The only one for which there is no actual human dietary requirement is carbohydrates. The only one. And humans are, in fact, able to produce all the needed glucose in the body from a combination of protein and fat in the diet. We can make all we need, folks. We don't have to eat any of it. How, you ask? Well, there's this thing called gluconeogenesis. It occurs in the liver. It's a process by which glucose is made primarily in the liver from non-carbohydrate sources, I underlined. The body is able to make glucose from amino acids, in other words, protein, glycerol, the backbone of triglycerides, and the primary fat storage molecule, and glucose metabolism intermediaries like lactate and pyruvate. It's all very complicated, and this is what it looks like. And yes, let's go with point by point. No, let's not. But it's, you know, it actually looks very complicated, but in fact the body is very efficient at doing this. So what's so bad about carbs? Well, all non-fibrous carbohydrates are sugar once they're metabolized by the body. I don't care if it's a complex carb. I don't care if it's a candy bar. In fact, the carbohydrates in potatoes are much higher glycemic, give you a much bigger slam in terms of insulin than even a candy bar will, because it's just pure glucose. Once that starch structure breaks apart, it's just pure glucose. Sugar molecules wreak havoc on human tissues through glycation and oxidative free radical damage. And again, glycation is this process by which sugar molecules will combine with proteins and fats in the body and cause them to get sticky and misshapen and start to malfunction over time, so that it deteriorates the functioning of our organs, our tissues, our brains, everything. And it's sort of this, it's one of the basic fundamental mechanisms by which we age. Carbohydrates are the primary macronutrient that trigger insulin production, the primary one. They're the one that are most likely to trigger insulin. And elevated insulin is associated with adverse metabolic endocrine effects, and very much so a shorter lifespan. The literature is just simply overwhelming in this respect. The degree to which you can minimize insulin in your life, in your body, the longer you will live and the healthier you will be by far. We need some insulin for some things, so not everybody should run out and sign up for being type 1 diabetic. I'm not saying that. But we need a tiny little bit, but we want to keep that to a minimum. So high carbohydrate diets, they lower HDL, they raise triglycerides or blood fats. Elevated triglycerides, of course, are a known risk factor for heart disease and obesity and metabolic syndrome, which is a very vicious cycle that can include things like all kinds of endocrine disruption, and also making you more susceptible to food sensitivity issues and immune dysregulation. And that's, again, could be a whole other lecture unto itself. Eating too many carbohydrates makes LDL particles smaller and denser. In other words, LDL, I mean, HDL and LDL, of course, those aren't cholesterol, right? Everybody gets that. It's high-density lipoproteins, low-density lipoproteins. Cholesterol is cholesterol. There's only one kind of cholesterol. And these LDL and HDL just simply reflect transport mechanisms. HDL takes cholesterol away from LDL takes cholesterol away from the liver out to the periphery of your tissues. It's what you make your hormones from. And HDL recycles that back to the liver, so it can go back out as LDL again. There tends to be a higher percentage of HDL in people with healthier diets, but actually that's not altogether true all the time 100% either. If you have HDL in excess of roughly 75 or 80, you're probably looking at, unless it's a familial genetic thing for you, you're probably looking at some hidden source of inflammation someplace. I see it a lot with autoimmune, actually. People with, look, my HDL is 120. Isn't that great? Maybe not so much. There's something called the peroxidase system that that's associated with inflammatory processes that's also responsible for making HDL. And